Going inside the insides of Playdead's inside, apart from being one of the strangest things I think I've ever said, will be a critical look into one of 2016's most anticipated indie titles, and certainly one of my favourites. Welcome to the first episode of Game Intro Breakdowns, where I'll be applying a critical lens to the first few minutes of a game to ascertain what I think it accomplishes well, and where I think it could have been improved. And warning, there will be spoilers throughout. Released for Steam on July 7th, 2016, Inside is a 2.5D side-scrolling puzzle platformer that follows the exploits of a small boy in a big, scary world. It was made by the Denmark-based developer Playdead, who previously released Limbo in 2010, a 2D side-scrolling puzzle platformer that follows the exploits of a small boy in a big, scary world. It's clear that wherever Playdead's roots are, they're planted deep. But despite the similarities of both games, being wonderfully animated, darkly humorous, and magnificently picturesque, by the end of Inside, it couldn't be clearer that you're dealing with a very different beast. In spite of its name, Inside is a game with enormous scope in comparison to its smaller, more humble predecessor, and this can be seen to work both in its favour and to its detriment. Although you're essentially still moving along a 2D plane, the locations you run, jump and fall through are impressive in their variety and level of detail. There are no more layers of silhouettes obscured by mist and a heavy noise filter. The art style is fully three-dimensional, and the game benefits enormously from it, not merely because the background can now be used to achieve greater levels of environmental storytelling. The player will encounter many other fully modelled, fully animated characters along their way, which is another step up from the few scripted encounters with the children and animals of Limbo. The addition of the large quantity of human NPCs is probably the single greatest change between the old game and the new one, which is important as it symbolises the change in focus for the story. With so many people wandering about, the game can't retain the sense of bleak loneliness of its predecessor, and it never tries to. Instead, it takes advantage of its heightened production values by ambitiously seeking to tell a larger tale about a society both rural and urban, challenging the player to find answers to the questions it raises about population control, industry, scientific experimentation, and the morality governing each of them. There are two major shifts in gameplay that take place, and if you've played the game, you'll likely know exactly what I'm referring to, so I believe it's easy to split the game into three main acts. Of these three acts, the first, which consists of roughly the first half of the game, is the strongest, and my personal favourite. And of this first act, the first 5 minutes serve as Inside's introduction, setting the stage for the rest of the game. For this, among other reasons, I consider it to be the beating heart of the game. It's the part that conforms most to the expectations of the player, but for what it accomplishes, I consider this to be no bad thing. When I booted up the game for a second playthrough, this section was among the things I was looking forward to the most, and it's not hard to see why. The game is gorgeous. No amount of words can express how beautiful it looks, so I'll just go ahead and say it again. This game is gorgeous. There's no need to preface that statement with anything. It doesn't just look good, and it pains me to even say this aloud, for an indie game. Inside and Limbo both strike me as games that will age well. But in Inside's case, this is especially so, and it accomplishes this without the simplicity of the visuals feeling like a budgetary limitation. In Limbo, the entire world was black and white, but features like the texture of the grass and the hairs on the spider gave it a very painterly feel, almost as though the game world had been painted with a grubby paintbrush. This is something that transitioned very smoothly from the concept art all the way through to the final release. It looked a little like a children's story from hell that had been hand-illustrated. In Inside, the colour palette is infinitely more variable than its grayscale predecessor, and very cool in tone. Inspired by a blog on Tumblr that creates coloured barcode representations of the full runtime of a film, I decided to make my own barcode of my playthrough of the game. It's interesting to note not only the very consistent use of various shades of blue, but also the ease with which you can recognise certain events in the game, even from such a compressed representation. For example, the warmer colours in the middle, which represent the section where the player is expected to amass a group of bodies together to open a door, and also the gentle gradient at the end of the colour barcode, where, after finally coming to a halt, the camera slowly pulls back at the end of the game. Unhappy with the useful but uneven way the colours turned out, I decided to stretch the barcode for aesthetic appeal, and I'll include both versions in the description if you're interested. So with the addition of colour, Inside's already looking very different to its predecessor, but that's just the beginning. For Inside, the developer created a temporal anti-aliasing filter for the game in the transition from their own proprietary engine to the Unity engine, and this certainly helps the game to stand out with its own individual style. The characters and environments are very smooth thanks to the filter, and surfaces in the game like roads, walls and floors lack any specific texture, instead relying on the strong lighting to keep them visually interesting. In fact, it took me a little while to realise just what the art design really reminded me of. It was niggling in the back of my head for the first few minutes of the game, but when I came to this road by the barricades, it suddenly dawned on me. The barricade is really what gave it away. It looks like a model, a plastic one, and in fact a lot of the features in the game resemble something you might find in, say, a model train set. The player character is no exception, with their hands that lack individually defined fingers, and the face which is entirely blank. However, far from a criticism of the game, I believe this look works well because of the other techniques that Playdead incorporated into it. The water throughout the game is astounding, reflecting the environment beautifully in real time, and various other smoke and particle effects do a good job of enhancing the atmosphere in any given gameplay scenario. The lighting too is stellar, and I'll be speaking more about it as we go through the introduction. But the foreground and background elements, and their respective framing, are what gives Inside that level of polish and sophistication that elevates it from a good-looking game into one of my favourite-looking games of all time. Often seen in either stark black or various shades of bluish-grey, the silhouettes of buildings and objects in the foreground and background enhance the sensation of movement in the game. They create and maintain the illusion of a world beyond the frame we're viewing it from, and most of all, they instill a picturesque quality to the screen, which is more akin to photography in Inside than the painterly style in Limbo. These silhouettes can even subtly scare the shit out of you. So basically what I'm saying is that Inside looks nice. It looks really, really nice. And that's the problem. When people give their opinions of the game online, including in professional reviews, I've seen the words beautiful and atmospheric tossed around a lot. And that's unfortunate, because even when used as compliments, these words on their own greatly simplify the many different systems that are working together to create that effect. In a way, this is part of what I love about Playdead's games. They have a knack for making something incredibly complicated look very simple, which is what great art should always be doing. But in truth, there's nothing simple about it. The game uses a variety of techniques to create the environments, and in doing so, it talks to the player through a very sophisticated visual language. It feels strange and just a little like sacrilege to take a game that demonstrates beautifully how ideas and emotions can be expressed without the use of any words and talk all over it. But let's do it anyway. To start with, I'd like to say that like many good-looking things, Inside is entirely aware of how beautiful it is. The environment is everything. Unlike Inside's predecessor, there's no excuse of an abstract purgatorial world, so the space behind and in front of the player this time around has to make sense as a world that could theoretically exist. It does this whilst also hinting at puzzle solutions, and raising questions about what exactly is going on in this world. But what's more obvious is that it's also there to simply give the player something to look at. The player is going to spend the majority of their time running from the left side of the screen to the right. They're never in control of the camera. It either stops scrolling at the end of the currently explorable space in the game world, or scrolls with the player character, occasionally zooming out to give the player a better view of their surroundings. In addition to this, the player's speed is fixed. So that means that for a large part of the game, the only interaction the player will have is pushing the directional stick right, or if you decided to be contrary and use the keyboard set up instead, holding a single button down. These stretches of simple running don't challenge the player's reflexes or intelligence, so it's important to use something that keeps the player invested in what's happening on screen, especially when these sections will largely play out the same way through multiple playthroughs. The visual design accomplishes this, to such an extent that the game at times looks almost as though it was made for screenshots. This can be seen in what is possibly my favourite level selection system, in which each thumbnail is a full screen picture that, when chosen, seamlessly transitions to that exact image after a few moments. But these screenshot thumbnails accomplish far more than simply looking pretty. They demonstrate the vast environmental differences between the various sections of the game, which is important because if the player didn't very clearly recognise what part of the game each thumbnail was representing, picking the different levels would be a guessing game. So what exactly constitutes the visual design of Inside? And why do I keep harping on about this aspect of the game when there are so many other features to discuss? As you may have gathered, I think the presentation in particular is one of the game's greatest strengths, and I've chosen the opening few moments of the game to demonstrate exactly why this is. It's an excellent example of a game that communicates a lot with seemingly very little. Let's take a look at the main menu screen, the first thing the player sees, and in particular how the game manages to convey life and movement in a frame that at first glance seems completely still. The use of empty or negative space is very important here. The foreground silhouette is completely black, comprising of rocks, twigs, and trees that will scroll in front of the player when they move, obscuring them momentarily. The uncompromising darkness of these silhouettes clearly communicates the areas of the game that are not traversable by the player, namely anything save for the straight, two-dimensional line ahead of them. There could be anything in the darkness to the left of the screen by the rocks, but the game uses complete darkness as a way of communicating to the player that there is nothing beyond that point, setting up the level boundaries. Notice the use of empty space in the frame. The bottom of the frame is completely dark, and it's interesting how cinematic it makes the game feel. I consider it no coincidence that the black area at the bottom of the screen shares similarities with the letterboxing that is present when watching films at home on a standard 16:9 monitor. This letterboxing only exists as part of a difference in ratio from capture size to screen size, but it's come to embody the feeling of cinema to a certain extent, to the point where amateur filmmakers sometimes artificially place these bars over full-screen standard 16:9 footage, just to achieve that look. Games like The Evil Within run entirely with cinematic letterboxing, and even in games that don't feature consistent letterboxing, moments within the game such as cutscenes can still be letterboxed, if the cutscene was created at a different aspect ratio.
I'm not your Mary.
It's become part of the visual language of video games, for better or worse. But this isn't the only example of empty space. Almost the first third of the screen is completely shrouded in darkness, which follows the rule of thirds. It's a classic and yet somewhat paradoxical rule of photography, that when you want to make a subject or environment look interesting, you don't place it in the middle of the frame, but rather to the side, and that they tend to look best when they conform to lines that split the frame into thirds. Now, it's not strict mathematics, and the thirds don't need to be measured perfectly, but even a loose following of the rule of thirds can have a drastic effect on how a picture commands your attention. You can see that rule being applied here, and I believe it's a large part of why the frame is so visually appealing. If you split it into thirds horizontally, you can see how perfectly the image follows this rule. The line on the left is created by the contrast between the light and darkness, and if we look to the right, we see that the lighter half of the screen is split almost perfectly by a silhouette of a tree. It leans slightly to the left, to make the framing still seem to be part of a natural forest environment, but it's unmistakable how it combines with the empty space on the left to split the screen into thirds. Moving on, the middle ground area is composed of rocks, leaves, and the traversable path that the player will navigate, and thankfully there's more colour going on here. The rocks are clean models, without any texture, but the way they're lit gives them plenty of shades of brownish grey. What really makes it pop are the static leaves that are dusted over the rocks and the path. Their yellow and red colours create a trail for the player to follow, and also give the otherwise clean and crisp visuals a little clutter to give the eye something to look at. Without this dusting of leaves, the area would look far simpler, and it wouldn't seem nearly as detailed or realistic for a forest floor. The background is harder to break down because of the way the layers overlap with each other, but what you can clearly see is the depth that the silhouettes of the trees provide, which will scroll at different speeds when the player moves. These trees break up the dingy grey background to create the impression of a large forest, and even without colour, they're incredibly important for the effect they provide. Notice how the trees are three-dimensional, with features that are smooth and modelled, instead of mere scrolling and obscured silhouettes, like those of the background in Limbo. I'm very happy that Playdead decided to spend the extra time modelling trees the player will never get a chance to see up close, or in any detail. All of the features described are what physically make up the frame, and on their own they might make for a pretty picture. But inside isn't a picture, it's a video game, and far from still life in motion, what it seeks to evoke is a living, breathing world. It uses some clever tricks to achieve this. First of all, the clusters of dark leaves overhead sway gently to give the impression that there's a soft breeze blowing. There are also 3 places where individually animated leaves fall down to the ground, which happens seemingly in random patterns, even if you'd only really be able to focus on them if you stopped dead in your tracks. These leaf animations are so subtle that I don't remember noticing them the first time I played the game, but I think the motion they add to the frame is important, even if you'd only really be able to focus on them if you stopped dead in your tracks. In addition to these few falling leaves, there's also some animated rainfall, only a few sparse drops, which suggests that there's a soft rain above that's only just able to break through the canopy of leaves overhead. The effect is good. The rain falls quickly and the drops themselves are few and far between, giving only a little hint of the heavier weather effects that the player will encounter later on. It also helps enhance the moody feel. One of the larger environmental effects is the layer of mist that has been applied to the scene. This mistiness creates very subtle clouds that lazily drift around, fading in and out of view, and only slightly obscuring the background. Together with the rain, these effects give me the strong impression that the forest is a damp, cold, and rather unpleasant place to be stuck in. The mist interacts very well with the lighting in the scene, adding motion without drastically changing the light and dark areas so much that it becomes distracting. I sped the footage up to observe the effect of the mist on the frame, and it's surprising just how important it is, especially when your eyes glide so easily over it in the low lighting. And speaking of lighting, the last environmental feature used to add motion to the frame is probably my favourite. It's not much either. There's a little particle effect working on the bottom left near the rocks, where the light is at its heaviest. These small dust particles disappear and reappear at random, as though they're entering and leaving the beam of light. If you look closely, you'll see that the particles don't follow the beam of light up towards the top right of the screen, despite the fact that in real life the light should be stronger there. These particles stay at the bottom left, which I think is an incredibly important decision that favours aesthetic appeal over realism. If these tiny dots were floating all the way along the beam of light, I think the effect would be greatly diminished, and the careful composition of the frame would end up looking a little messy. The final 2 features that add movement to the frame aren't environmental in any way, but are no less important to the overall effect. The first of these is the grain filter, which is what adds the fuzziness to the picture. It's another example of the game taking inspiration from modern cinematic techniques. A lot of movies made in the modern day feature crisp, clear visuals, thanks to technological advancements that produce clearer and clearer pictures in lower light. Because of this, the graininess of old-fashioned films is now often deliberately added for aesthetic purposes, either to communicate to the audience that a scene is taking place in the past, or simply to add a little texture to what would otherwise be very clean, sterile images. This very technique was used heavily in Limbo, and although it's dialed back a lot in Inside, it's still present, and rightfully so. Thanks to the grain filter, barring the complete darkness of the foreground silhouettes, everything within the frame appears to be moving ever so slightly with the flicker of the grain movement. The final technique for adding motion was probably felt very strongly a few moments ago when I sped the footage up. It's the camera itself, which sways smoothly from left to right. Like with the mist, the effect is so subtle that you need to speed the footage up to really witness it in action, and yet the movement contributes so much to the feeling of life in the game. There seems to be a little restlessness to the slow but constant movements, and yet the movements are subtle enough to seem also to be hesitant, as though, like the player, the camera is eager to keep moving forwards, but is also somewhat trepidatious as to what it might find. And that's a list of the elements that come together to first create a still, picturesque environment, and then breathe life into it. I'm sure it's not an exhaustive list either. That's the problem with looking for subtle effects. The fact that you don't see them is how you know they're working. All of these various techniques, three-dimensional models, sprites, and systems come together with carefully considered positioning to deliver an image that the player will probably spend less than 10 seconds looking at. Cues and techniques from cinema and photography have been painstakingly applied to the frame to be the first thing the player sees, and the impression it creates, I think, is worth the effort. It's art. It looks like something you'd want to hang on a wall, even though it comes with the added bonus of being beautifully animated and delivering information to the player in a clear and concise manner. And it does this environment after environment after environment. I don't, and I wish I did, but I don't possess the madness to try and go into this level of detail over every area of the introduction. But as we go from place to place, I'll do my best to point out any points of interest. Now that I've talked about one of the game's best features, I think it's time to give a little thought to what is doubtlessly the highlight of the game. The boy in Inside is probably my favourite silent protagonist of any game. He's so meticulously animated, and there's so much detail put into the exact way he's running and breathing that I easily got attached to the character. He feels good to control, with just enough weight to convince me that there's a little boy moving on the other end of the puppet strings, and the numerous subtle ways he's characterised paint a clear picture of exactly what he's feeling, whether it's fear, fatigue, or even curiosity. I'm sorry to stay on this image a little longer, I'm sure if anything you feel too familiar with it at this point, but before we go on, I'd like to spend just a moment on his introduction. To move on past the title screen, all the player has to do is tap any old button and it'll fade away. Then, a few moments later, the boy makes his proud, if tentative, debut, which couldn't be more unsuspecting and subdued when you consider the way the character ends up. A few rocks and a twig are animated to fall when he appears to give the landing some weight, as though he's really interacting with the environment, and the way he bends over to absorb the impact effectively establishes his humanity and his fallibility. He's no super meat boy, and the player is told this clearly. They're dealing with a normal boy, and the way he lands conveys to them that this isn't the kind of character who will survive a fall from any height, like a character from a traditional platformer would. The boy has an idle animation, which is standard for video game characters. It plays whenever they're not being prodded about by the player, and makes the character seem more like a real living thing. But right away, the character's head seems to turn and look around itself. I like this little touch. It suggests that he's not entirely sure where he's ended up after sliding down the rock side. It's a very human thing, but it's also important in setting up that the character will automatically look towards objects of interest in the game world. His red shirt also adds a little colour to the scene that immediately draws your eye, which ensures that he'll be easy to make out in any of the locations in the game at a moment's notice. What completes the look is the small gap between the trousers and the shoes, which ensures that the distinction between these two clothing items is clear, and ensures that you can tell from a glance the positioning of his limbs. His hands, feet and head are the lightest parts of the character model, and the contrast makes it easy to appreciate his meticulously animated movement, especially when they're often the brightest thing on screen. There are very few flaws that I found with the boy's overall visual and mechanical design. One of them is something I'll point out now, and I'll say ahead of time that it's incredibly pedantic. It's one of those stupid things that I hated myself for noticing, and yet couldn't forget after I'd seen it, even though it's a small issue that might only exist in my head, like the medical mask worn by the protagonist of Lone Survivor, which many people, not myself, but many people on the internet thought looked like a smile. The issue is the back of his head. When the boy's directly inside the area of a light source, the hands and back of the shoulders are highlighted, which nicely gives the character model some depth, and makes him pop out from the background. It's an important touch, one that prevents his dark hair from seeming flat or fading into the background, but it can sometimes make him look like he has a bald patch. This isn't an issue in many areas of the game, but when his character model is in a darker section with less intense lighting, the highlight at the back of his head can end up looking as bright and pale as his skin tone, which can be a little distracting. There doesn't appear to be a simple solution for this either, as the highlights seem to be the result of light illuminating the model in real time, instead of just an applied effect. In the rain, it's not even noticeable, because in these conditions it has a glossy effect that resembles slick hair, a glossy effect that's also seen on his shoulders. I spent some time considering a possible solution, but it wouldn't be a simple fix, and as I stated earlier, it's something that only bothers me in a few areas of the game. It says a lot about the polish of the boy's character design that the only flaw I could find was something that isn't distracting at all to the vast majority of players. Moving on from my petty pedantry though, I have nothing but praise for the quality and sheer variety of his animations. His arms lift naturally after falling, and they flail to catch his balance after landing. The running is fast and fluid. There's a natural pleasing bob to it, and the way he'll slow himself down and adjust his body to run in the opposite direction is flawlessly smooth. The trail of leaves the boy kicks up is a nice touch, even though his feet aren't actually interacting with the leaves on the trail, and it's actually just a particle effect that's attached to the bottom of the character model. The breathing sound effects, which are synced up to the steps, really do a great job of selling the run, which is also highlighted by the varied footfall sounds, which transition from crunching leaves, bare earth, and flat wood seamlessly. They even use different sound effects for the landing, emphasising the crunch of the impact instead of simply raising the volume of the standard footfall sound effect. All the while this is going on, his head seems to react perfectly organically to what's going on around him. When on the log, it looks down as though he's gauging the surface to balance himself. Even the tiny way his arm whips through the air as he first climbs on the log and pauses is nothing short of astounding. Every animation blends together so smoothly that trying to figure out the various animation states behind the scenes started to make my head hurt, so I gave up very early into the game. It's a lot easier to believe that it's magic, and to be honest it still feels like that. Inside is one of those games that asks a lot of questions, but it rarely ever prompts players to question the design behind the game world itself. The only issue I could find with it was something that I had to induce myself, which is that by repeatedly tapping in a certain direction, the character can move without the animation playing fluidly, which looks a little silly. The only solution I could think of is that the game ensures the boy takes a complete step before coming to a stop, even if the button ceases to be held, but this is a platformer, and precise, tight controls are the difference between life and death. It's a very small problem, and I consider it insignificant in the grand scheme of things, because the only way to experience the problem is to make it yourself. The majority of people will never see the boy animated in this way, and there's no gameplay incentive whatsoever to perform this kind of movement. Now, as we're coming to the fence, I'd like to point out another of the animation touches in the game that I love, and that I think too few people will ever appreciate. The player is never told this, but they have two ways to traverse the fence. They can either hop over it with a jump, or simply push the stick to prompt the character to squeeze themselves through the gap in the bars. After the log, a few players might have the instinct to jump over it like it's an obstacle, but others might fear that the barbed wire could damage them, and decide instead that the boy's small size should allow them to push through. For the record, I jumped over the barbed wire on my first playthrough. This is a small choice, and it doesn't matter. It has no effect on the events that follow, but both of these events were animated. If you decide to jump over the fence, a special animation plays where the boy clearly contorts himself to avoid the barbed wire. It's an interaction that never happens again in the game, and if you decide not to jump over the fence, you'll never see it at all. But on multiple playthroughs, these small choices will add up, making the game feel that little bit different each time, especially when the player realises that they can do things slightly differently this time around. As the player approaches one of the few story elements of the intro, the van, the character will lower themselves automatically into a crouching stance and slow down, suggesting to the player that the situation is potentially dangerous, and also adding further believability to the character's movements. You're not controlling a lifeless husk, at least we don't think so at this point, and the boy's reactions are realistic. He doesn't want to get caught any more than you do, and the fact that you can't speed him back up is important to the game's feel. It's more like nudging a character along their way than precisely controlling something that's supposed to be a cipher for the player. I particularly like the way he automatically takes cover behind objects. It gives the game a cover system without the game ever feeling like it has a cover system. When the truck disappears, the character stops crouching, and the player can move at full speed again. Although it's handled automatically, it doesn't feel limiting to suddenly have some of your control over the speed of the character taken away. In some games, the player character will suddenly slow down, normally to allow the game enough time to dump some exposition on them by voiceover. In most of these cases, it feels cumbersome and forced, if only because these situations could have been handled far better, without resorting to wrenching the player's control away so heavy-handedly. In Inside, I really don't feel that. The sneaking animation is a little like the stumbling animation. It's not completely necessary to the design of the game. It could have been assigned to a button. But when you have a character with an identity other than that of the player, having him automatically sneak around in situations where a boy like him would be terrified informs his character, maintains realism, feels good to play, and isn't a cheap excuse to shove exposition in the player's face. It kills multiple birds with one stone. Some people might point out that the scripted sequence that plays out in the background is Inside's equivalent of a cutscene, and that forcing them to slow down is merely an exposition dump in a different way, but I'd strongly disagree, if only because the timing of the man knocking on the truck, and the truck reversing and leaving, could have easily been changed to ensure that even running at full speed, the player would have witnessed everything the developer wanted them to see. It's a good choice, and it's used later on to explain to players without words that danger is near, and that the mode of play has shifted slightly. It's interesting to note how the game eases the player into the danger of the world. I'm going to do something I've never done before, and compare this to a design decision in Limbo. If you haven't played Limbo, feel free to find this obnoxious. I really should get round to doing a video on Limbo at some point, but until then, the similarities between the two games and their shared developer is enough reason for the comparison. The player can die within a minute of the game starting, and unless you've played the game before, it can be a real shock to see the boy get unceremoniously impaled, which the game makes you watch for several seconds before mercifully restarting from the last checkpoint. There's no telegraphing of the danger, no audio cues, animations, or use of lighting to highlight the risk. The game trusts the player to see the sharp silhouettes of the spikes and assume that they're a hazard. If not, they're punished immediately. That's the charm of the game. Seasoned gamers and people on their second playthrough will leap over the pit without a second thought, but the first time going through the game, dying here can be a real wake-up call, even though it's entirely avoidable. The first encounter with humans in Inside, well, the first encounter with people, allow me to briefly digress. The issue with talking about Inside is that you have to define the subjects that you're talking about, which will reflect on how you interpreted the story, but not necessarily what the story is actually about. Saying that the masked figure beside the van, the figures inside the van, or even the protagonist is human is a story assumption. If you call them people, you've dismissed or failed to consider the possibility that they could also be aliens, automatons, clones, or scientific experiments, even if the latter two aren't mutually exclusive. Because of this, here's a handy rundown of all the descriptors that I'll be using for things you see throughout the game. I call the protagonist a boy, because it's an easy description, and I believe personally that he's human for reasons I may explore later on. I'll also be referring to the masked figures as human, in addition to the scientists you see later on. The grey, lifeless, controllable figures you see throughout the game I'm less certain about. And when I say lifeless, I mean without autonomy, or the instinct for self-preservation seen in most forms of organic life. I like the phrase the Wikipedia article used to describe them though. So I'll call them lifeless grey bodies, or LGBs, because all of the description is true, but no assumptions are made as to the precise nature of those bodies. I refer to the mysterious underwater creatures as sirens, because everyone on the internet has already recognised the parallels between these enemies in the game and the mythical monsters with long, beautiful hair that dwell in water and pull unsuspecting sailors underneath to drown. And I can think of no better name for this thing than the cluster. That much is clear, it's a cluster. A cluster of what exactly, I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure I'd want to know either, but there you go. So the first encounter with humans in Inside sets up that they're a potential hazard. The masked man has clearly packed a load of strangers into the back of a van, and your small size, as well as the sudden shift to stealth animations, tells the player that they don't want to be seen by these people, presumably to avoid ending up in the van with the rest of them. But in the first encounter, it's impossible to be caught. The man moves too quickly to see the player, his back always faces the player, and the van, even when reversing, will never notice the player either. I think it's fair to say that the game considers this fair warning. Some kind of shady business is going on, and it seems to be a good idea to stay away from it. At the second encounter, however, the game is still quite forgiving. You'll automatically snap a twig when you land that'll get the attention of two very ominous-looking men with masks, and when they turn a torch on, it's clear that they'll be looking for you, which also sets up the idea that lights in the game aren't a source of safety, but how you'll be spotted by the enemy. Now there's a pod that's fallen on its side that can provide cover to the player, but there's also a shelf of land next to it that will similarly shield them. If the player does nothing after triggering the sound effect, they can stay exactly where they are, and the two masked men will simply wander away to the left, allowing the player to remain undetected. The long length of cover the shelf and fallen pod provides is also so much that the only way for the player to get caught here is either to jump up and down, which they've been trained not to want to do because jumping down is what caused the suspicion in the first place, or run straight out into the open. But the animation of the suspicion is so well timed that the player will always see the torch get turned on first, before it's trained on the fallen pod. If the player decides to run out into the open after that, I think they deserve the smothering. The game's done enough to warn them, but I think the game could have done a little more to encourage players to actively hide from the figures, instead of simply freezing and waiting for them to pass. If they removed the small shelf from the left of the pod, then after the figures look up, the player would have no choice but to move forward slowly and hide behind the pod itself, establishing clearly that in this world, the player should never allow themselves to rest on their laurels. I think I understand partially why the shelf is there. It's because if that small section of protection from their line of sight wasn't there, players might panic and try to jump back up, and jumping while the figures are still in front of you will always get their attention. And if they hear you whilst you're trying to jump fruitlessly back up to the ledge, then you'll die, triggering a death animation that ends up looking very suspect. It's odd to note as well that in the other animation, they appear to choke the player to death, or at least unconsciousness, even though their hands are very clearly over the boy's eyes. But it's a very small nitpick. The issue at hand is that the game does the equivalent of the truck scene here again. If you do nothing, you'll be fine, and that's just a little too forgiving, demanding no quick thinking or common sense from the player like the rest of the game does. I mentioned earlier that if the safety of the shelf was removed, players might panic and try to jump back up the ledge, which looks possible at first. The solution here would therefore be to make the drop higher, to ensure that players know for a fact that there's no going back. It would only be a subtle change, but I think it would really add to the feeling of panic when they realise they're helpless, and the feeling of relief when they decide of their own volition to move closer to danger, but also lessening the risk of discovery. This way, the player has earned their survival, not merely been handed it. The enemies themselves feel a tad scripted too. If you stick around until they're almost finished walking to the left, you can jump to your heart's content and they'll no longer hear you, despite the fact that they're closer to you now than they were before. It just feels a little like the game designers thought the enemies have accomplished everything they need to. Once they move to the left of the screen, their job is done. And they're right, but I'd have liked to have seen that little bit of extra polish that punishes players that get too comfortable and go back to investigate. Just before we move on, note the presence of the pods in the scene, which foreshadows their importance later on in the game, and raises some serious questions on a second playthrough. In the next area, we're introduced to the only other button that's used in the game, the grab button, which presses buttons and pulls levers, but is mostly used to push around boxes and crates. The dove is a nice touch, distinct from the seagull encounter later on, and the empty space that the light draws attention to clearly spells out how the player is supposed to traverse over the wall to the right. They really sell the weight of the refrigerator with the explosion of leaves, and I love how it demonstrates the way that interactive objects work in this game. It's 2.5D for a reason. The boy can walk straight past them easily, which means there's no more having to awkwardly jump back and forth across an object that's blocking the way. You can just run straight past it. The player can grab and maneuver the object from anywhere, each animation for this being slightly different, and when you climb on top of it, the character steps backwards onto it. This is probably the best mechanical change between the old game and the new one. It's non-intrusive, and in fact players might not even notice for some time that anything's different, but the flexibility and choice it adds to the player movement without requiring any additional input from the player is very welcome, and the kind of improvement you expect to see in a sequel. The big difference is in the feel. The object doesn't feel as substantially there as before, only somewhat occupying the 3D space, as though there are the foreground elements and the space they occupy, the traversable middle ground path for the player to follow, a second middle ground path where movable objects exist, and then the background. In Limbo, there are a few sections on conveyor belts where you have to jump on small boxes with very precise timing. I noticed that there are no such sections in Inside, and aside from wanting to avoid sticking too close to the formula, I have to wonder if Playdead avoided these kinds of challenges because of the transition to 2.5D. I think this is likely the case. In Limbo, if there's a box in the way, you'll be stopped by it, and if you jump towards it, you'll climb onto it 100% of the time very quickly. In Inside, even though it essentially works the same way, the jump onto the box takes longer, and it feels a little floaty, because if the boy is already mostly through the arc of the jump, it seems that the box is pulling the boy towards it to ensure they land on top. This is a small concession to make for what the new system achieves, however, and although I like the timed platforming challenges in Limbo, I also died plenty of times when playing them. The new system is used to create a different type of challenge, and I think that's important in establishing the identity of Inside as a game unto itself, not merely the sequel of Limbo, no matter how many times I refer to it as such. Here we see the truck and get introduced to the dogs as a new enemy type. The framing here again is beautiful, and we literally get a leading line in the form of the white lines of paint on the road that draw your eye right from the bottom of the screen to the top. It's a little strange that these enemies here don't react to you though. The first time I played through this section, I was quiet and stealthy, not taking any chances, but when I decided to mess around later on, it was odd and a little amusing that they don't seem to care in the slightest about you. To give the two masked men two separate death sequences, but then not give these three silhouetted figures the chance to at least spot you strikes me as strange. I understand that the developers want players to be sneaky, and making it impossible for the enemy to spot you is the easiest way to make players feel like they've successfully stolen past the enemy, but jumping around right in front of them doesn't get any reaction at all, not even from the dogs. Even if they just sent out the dog to kill you immediately, I think it would be an improvement, because the framing of the situation is clearly very serious, and players not willing to take the threat as seriously need to be told very quickly what kind of game they're playing. Inside isn't one of those games that likes to hold the player's hand, but from these opening encounters you might be forgiven for thinking it is. It's perfect when you play the game through the first time as the developers intended, taking each threat seriously and following the instructions of the visual and audio cues around you. When you push back and start messing around, however, you can begin to make out the seams. After pushing a crate, the next area forces you down a long slide and traps you in a waist-deep river. Note the lack of background elements and the presence of the flashlights that the player's been taught to avoid. You're out in the open, and the sense of helplessness is palpable, especially when the dog starts paddling towards you with alarming speed. The short run from the dog is perfect. It's timed just right, and I bet I wasn't the only person that didn't know where I was jumping to when I pressed the button. It was a relief to find the boy clutching onto some branches in the darkness, even while the guard dog is frothing at the mouth only a few meters away. I think this encounter is perfect. The player can clearly tell from the steep slide that there's no way back up, and when the dog starts chasing them, they know they can only wade for their lives in the water before making a mad dash for it. The player knows exactly what to do, where to go, and what will happen, but somehow Playdead still manages to make the scenario intensely suspenseful. I particularly like the short look at the dog enemy that this situation affords you. It's an effective design, with the scraggly fur and the bright white mouth the most clearly defined features. It's basically mange and teeth, but that doesn't stop it being very intimidating, helped along by some truly furious barking sound effects, and especially by the deaths that play out if you should happen to get caught. I also like how the two masked men with the flashlights then get into the van, which follows you as part of the next encounter. The player could simply assume that the commotion they're causing has alerted some of the masked men who simply happen to be in a van, but the continuity of seeing it all take place in the background leads to a nice escalation in the action. You first see a vaguely ominous man by a truck, then two men with a flashlight who pose a clearer threat. Then from the checkpoint you see another two men with flashlights along with your first dog encounter, which leads to the escape from the truck and the mad dash from multiple men and dogs, which feels truly climactic because of the way it slowly ramps up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After your jump to safety, the game cruelly gives you just enough seconds of quiet to think you're safe before they throw a van at you. I particularly like how this section solves a small problem of game design, which is that in some games, jumping repeatedly can make the character move faster, but at the cost of looking ridiculous. You'll see this in games like the Ocarina of Time, and it's especially insufferable there, because the exertion noises released by the character loop over and over again, creating a grating sound that was never supposed to be endured by human ears. The player might be tempted to do this here, as well as in the water earlier, but to easily fix this, the game simply makes the character faster, which it does during a few other running sections. The increased speed makes it clear that this is the fastest way to travel, and that jumping would break the flow of the run, and in fact slow the character down. This enemy encounter with the van is probably my least favourite in the opening section. It's the first time I died in the game, but believe me when I say that that's not the issue. Instead, I dislike dying at that point in the game because it pulled me out of the experience. With no checkpoints or loading screens, Inside does a careful job of keeping your mind within the game world at all times, and at this part of the game, as the tension begins to ramp up towards a climactic leap of faith, it hurts to feel the pacing come to a halt as you die and get thrown back a few seconds. It hampers the experience, and I don't think it's necessary. I'm also saying this because I did look online at other people's experiences, and for a lot of players, it seems that this is their first death in the game. It would be a fine first death if it didn't feel so cheap. The last encounter the player had with an enemy just a few seconds ago sets up the pacing of these encounters as being things you'll often scrape through just by the skin of your teeth. That's why when the van appears, the player isn't tempted to try and make for the cover of trees they've just left, and why when they jump from the rock, they continue running. They've already got a scenario in their head that the flashlight will follow them and they'll find some cover just at the right time, avoiding danger. So when they end up getting darted, it feels anticlimactic and confusing. Limbo killed the player a lot too, but the outright insane levels of punishment the game puts the player through is suggestive of a very dark sense of humour. When the game sets up the expectation that the player knows how to avoid danger, and then swiftly and calmly destroys that expectation in front of them, the player will obviously feel cheated, and that the death's cheap. But they'll also likely find a certain element of humour in it. It's like the developers had their tongues in their cheeks as they designed the game. This is without mentioning the pacing of Limbo, which is set by the player most of the time. If you die, you replay a small section of the game again before you're able to carry on and experience new content. In the opening section of Inside, the player is reacting to the actions of others, and there's a clear narrative that's being told to the player through scripted events more than puzzles. It's a different style of gameplay, and the experience hurts when it's broken, especially when it doesn't feel like the responsibility of the player. When I was hit with a tranquilizer dart and slowly fell to the floor, I didn't find the situation funny or sad or tragic in any way. I was just a little confused. I wondered where I went wrong, as I am sure many others did. The solution, which is to jump from the outcrop of rocks and then hide behind them, doesn't feel like an intuitive thing to do, especially when there are no lighting or visual hints that there's any space under there at all, unless you're deliberately looking for it. If there were a few fireflies underneath the rocks that lit up after you jumped from the top, your eyes would be drawn to that area, and your first reaction would probably be surprise. Oh, there's an area under there, but maybe I should just keep running. Then, if the player decides to keep running and ends up being tranquilized, it's clear that they had the choice all along, and that they weren't tricked into suffering a cheap death. Uninformed gameplay decisions don't carry a lot of weight, because when you die as a result of them, they don't feel like they're your fault, because they're essentially not. What's irritating is that this situation could have been avoided completely if the masked men's flashlight took a slightly different path. If just before you jumped from the rock, the flashlight turned on towards the right side of the screen and slowly started moving towards the left, the player would be more likely to retreat towards the rocks, where they'd organically discover the cover there and survive the encounter. Each of these are small changes, but they would have made a world of difference. What they would have improved beyond anything is the sense that the player has made a choice, and the choice either does or does not pay off. The challenge in video games should always be to give you all of the right pieces and see if you can take them and slot them into the right places at the right times. When it withholds some of the pieces, the decisions the player makes are uninformed, and when the deaths aren't funny, poignant, or interesting, they cease to be worth the toll they take on the player, and the player's time. The opening section of Inside flows so well otherwise that I think it's the game, not merely the player, that deserves better. Luckily, this section of the game ends very well, and it's a memorable section. This is also where part of the game's dark humour begins to show itself, challenging you first to avoid the lights coming from the van, and then forcing you to creep directly in front of them, without any cover. It's a cruel trick to actually see and hear the car door opening too. You know for a fact that the masked men are there, but the player has no choice. The particle effect on the beam of light also serves to interestingly highlight how the scenic weather and particle effects in the opening scene of the game can be subverted instead to feel ominous and foreboding. The movement and signs of life that the particles convey is the last thing the player wants to be seeing around the van that has already killed them once already, and in the otherwise still frame, the tiny dust particles attract the eye very easily, daring the player to stop in their tracks and squint through the glare to try and make out any figures, even though they know that this is a place where they really shouldn't be hanging around. This final section within the forest is very well executed, especially when the music kicks in. I don't think I've ever experienced a video game in which the first 4 minutes are completely absent of any musical accompaniment, and it's especially odd in this case because it includes the title screen itself, where only ambient noises are heard. Before the game even starts, it sets a precedent for its sound design, which, unlike Limbo, relies far more on environmental effects than music. I'd like to talk more about this at a later date if I were given the chance to, but for this section at least, I have nothing but praise for the music. It's unexpected, and when it triggers just after the flashlight turns on, the sense of danger it creates is palpable. It really feels like the mode of play has been shifted. It's clear when the music starts that the player shouldn't be trying to sneak around anymore, they just need to keep running. I like how it achieves this without being fast-paced or pulse-pounding. It's not music you expect to find scoring a desperate chase, and yet it works perfectly. The log you have to jump over is a little cheaply placed. They could have introduced it earlier in the starting section to familiarise players with the use of these falling hazards in a safe environment first, and for the sake of the flow of gameplay in this last section I think they probably should have. But the log is physically large enough to be obvious as a hazard, and it helps players feel as though everything is out to get them, especially if they only think to jump over it at the last second. The second van encounter is far better, and almost solves the problems of the first. The light beams clearly go from the right of the screen to the left as the vehicle moves, and the only way to avoid it is to stay in cover until the vehicle passes. It really plays with your instincts, as you want to run immediately, but instead have to stay stuck between the two threats that are coming for you. I actually died here on my first playthrough, and I cursed the game for another cheap death, but in retrospect I concede to myself that the encounter is fairly designed, and I appreciate the considerations the developer took to ensure this. After the player jumps over the log, it's a fair assumption that the masked man will be slowed down somewhat, which is the first clue that the player has a little bit of time to play with. The second clue is the flashlight beam from the running masked man, which follows the player until they jump over the log, and then leaves them while the masked man focuses on stepping over the obstacle. The flashlight, which is the biggest visual hint as to the masked man's position, only reappears after the van's gone past, and signals that the masked man is catching up, and it's time to move again. If you're quick-witted and you pay attention to the visual cues, you should survive the first time without any problems, and be well on your way to the jump. The few shots the masked man fires at you when you land here are very panic-inducing, and the way the last shot rings out has a sense of finality to it, which makes it seem for a fraction of a second that the player is safe again, until the dogs start barking and running towards you. I like that there are 3 of them this time. Functionally there's no difference, but it helps to make you feel even more outnumbered. The game communicates effectively here that there's no way out of the situation, and that you can't run indefinitely from the threat, and there's a sense that most gamers will pick up on that they're going to have to jump. It's partially due to the camera, which zooms further and further out. It's the most dramatic camera shift so far, clearly setting up some kind of climactic moment. The player is smaller than ever in the frame, and as the cover of the trees thins to nothing, even though you could simply fall from the top, there's only one thing the player wants to do, and that's to take agency and jump into the unknown. In a way, I feel as though you've made a similar jump by clicking on this video, and I'm very grateful for it. It's astounding to think that so much thought and effort went into the first 5 minutes of the game, and picking it apart took far longer than I was expecting, considering that all of that was essentially just the game's introduction. If you found any of this interesting, then please let me know, and if enough people are interested, I'll continue my breakdown of Inside, where we'll be diving right into the game proper. In any case, thank you very much for watching.